Thanks a lot. Is my audio working? Okay. Thanks a lot. I was actually not expecting this many people. Like, this is a crowd you wouldn't see at around 8 in North America anywhere, so I'm very impressed. So thanks a lot for coming. Today's topic is about production, mainly about production. But when people think about production, they feel like production is completely maybe a separate topic. In the morning keynote, we realized that actually it's a huge spectrum, and I'm actually thinking about maybe going deep dive into the production aspects and like maybe more about production readiness today. As a disclaimer, I'm working for Google, so some of the practices here are like straight from Google, but also it's fair to say that I have worked for lots of companies in the last 10 years, small and large, so I think it's going to be a variety of different things that I've seen. Now I want to go back to the topic. This is such a dark topic for a dark evening, right? And I need to explain, I think, my emotional state before, digging into the topic. I say, production, and when I think about production, it's just like more of like this. It's a scary thing. Production has always been a scary thing to me. It's really intimidating. And morning keynote, when they ask, who is actually building package software? Nobody raised hands. So it seems like everybody is some sort of like operating some systems here, or sort of like, have some engagement with the production systems. So I want to ask, who is, developing production systems here? Who is, maintaining or like developing for production? And who feels nervous or feel intimidated by the production environment? That's fair, yeah. A lot of hands as well. So, DevOps, one of the reasons I'm asking this question, because our release pipeline and velocity is just so much higher than what it used to be, but still, it's somewhat struggling, especially when you're touching, really large-scale systems. So it's okay to be intimidated by production. This is personally where I would go and hide in anxiety sometimes, and this is something that I always fear to be responsible for. And it got better over time by learning and having experience. And having access to, I think, good practices. So this talk is about that. So when you're involved in activities in the production environment, I say that you might be suffering from some production anxiety, because there are a lot of questions. The initial question is, are we ready to push to production? Some people may just say yes, because tests all pass, whatever. Is that a good answer? So what is good or bad in terms of operating things? Who determines that, or who can say that we are actually ready to push? And how do we transfer knowledge? There's a lot going on. Some teams learn by trial and error. Some teams have more experienced people. So what's going on in terms of transfer knowledge among especially different teams? And we fail because it's expected to fail, but we also can learn from failure. And I think part of the questions around production readiness is, how do we share knowledge about failure as well? A while ago, I've been introduced to this concept called production readiness, and it does two things, actually. It ensures that a service meets some basic, operational readiness. And the second thing it does is the teams can actually benefit from organization-wide knowledge. So it does two things. And production readiness concept, this concept usually involves a reviewing process. And the reviews are called PRRs. And these reviews are just ensuring basically both items are satisfied. It's a way to say, oh, have we ruled out all the common mistakes we have done in the past that leads to failure? Or have we done enough of the good things so we will likely to see more success? So Reviews, when people think about reviews, it's like they sometimes assume that this is a one-off thing. We will just review and then move on. It's actually a part of the the life cycle of your service. We ideally think that reviews would not be useful for once, but many times. The most obvious thing is when you're launching a new production service, you may likely to go through the review. Or when you're introducing the reviews to an existing service, you also would like to go through the review. But the interesting case, for example, is handing off to a different team or some different team members. At Google, we were just having this conversation that SRE actually doesn't take your service if you're not aligning with their readiness review. They just want you to do the bare minimal, at least. So it's really useful when you're handing off because everybody gets on the same page. They at least understand what you have there. And when handing off to the new team members, it actually helps you to kind of like onboard people easily. They're kind of like getting on the same page, realizing what is there, what are some of the best practices, and so on. And the other thing is prepare an on-call support, especially if it's involving multiple teams. This is again like you're just sitting and like seeing what is there, so to be on the same page. Reviews are often as this like a checklist element, and it could be a checklist or more of like a questionnaire, and it touches a lot of variety of subjects. In this example, I am going to give you some examples from some of the design time related topics or development, configuration management, release management, some observability specific things, some security practices maybe, and capacity planning. So you may add more categories, but it's useful to categorize because experts can come in and like take a look, or you can actually like just pinpoint, hey, what are we going to do for capacity planning, and you can take a look at that subsection to have a better idea. Before digging more, I actually want to explain you why I think that reviews are helpful. Companies always end up like organically growing some practices and approaches when it comes to production experience. And each team would go and like figure that out themselves. And it's usually by trial and error. When it's about trial and error, it's always like have some tax, not on the success on the engineers, but also on the it's not a burden only on the projects, but also on the engineers. Engineers don't often feel confident enough, and this kind of like affects the release velocity. And trial and error culture is kind of like sometimes creating this like blameful culture because people usually finger point or like give references to each other. So that's not actually really contributing a lot. When blame is a very significant factor in an engineering culture, people will learn that over time that individuals actually want to contribute less because they feel like they can be found guilty. So production readiness is not the ultimate magic, but it's a good tool. And as I said, that it involves the key component is the review. And reviews are usually a checklist, and they can be done manually or automatically, or you can do them both. Most companies actually use a combination of both because it's actually very trivial to automate some of these checks, and some of them are extraordinarily hard because you need to go and validate the design docs and so on. So you would like to have a combination of both. It could be self-served, as in the team can do their own production review, or they can actually ask a team or like someone else to actually go through the review. Or when you are handing off or you're doing on-call support planning, you are sitting down with other people outside of your team to be involved in the review. Organizations sometimes tend to actually generate templates rather than just a checklist because everybody can share some sort of like common knowledge, but you need some flexibility in order to, add some specific things specific to your problem or your team. So I want to show you a checklist and give you some examples that what could be put there. Well, this is an example, not a complete solution. You can get some influences from this, but I think it's the best checklists are curated over time with experience and like especially with items specific to your team or organization. So in fact, a while ago, I published a checklist that we use internally with several modifications as a production guideline. It's not an actual checklist, but it's kind of like a digest way to explain people what to do, because we, as a cloud provider, we realize that we still need to propagate some knowledge, beyond the products and so on. Like we still need to explain our customers how to use things in specific ways. And even though like I kept talking about a single organization up to this point, I think as a platform provider, you can use checklists to go beyond a single company. They can be cross, companies. At Google, we have this CRE, which is kind of like an SRE, but for customers. So they've been doing this for a very long time, but they're doing it with customers who are paying a lot of money. They would go and go through their release process, help them, especially in cases where they're touching our services, they're heavily dependent on our services. So our production guideline is an example that, readiness checklist can go beyond one organization. And I will start digging into the checklist as an example. So I said that there might be multiple subcategories when it comes to lists. And this is the section for the design and development. And this is an example. I have 4 items here. And usually what you do is have these items and provide some rationale behind them. You explain why this item ended up being here. The first item is have reproducible builds. I think this is a very clear one, but your build shouldn't actually require access to external services and shouldn't be really affected by others of the external services. How many of you are dependent on GitHub in order to release something right now? If GitHub goes down, it means that you are not going to be able to push something new. Or I think the worst case of this is you won't be able to roll back, right? Like, imagine something bad happens, you are having an outage, you can't actually roll back if GitHub is also having an outage. So we always put this as the first item. The second thing is we define and set SLOs for the service you're designing at the design time. This is not just helping your monitoring story. This is also useful to kind of have some concrete numbers around about the availability goals. It's also impacting the design a lot, so it's useful to have them in the beginning. That's why the readiness checklist puts it. We check for this specifically and make sure that it was there at the design time. Documenting the availability expectations of external services is also very useful because you document basically their SLOs, and this also allows you to be able to plan for the downtime or kind of make design decisions based on their availabilities. You may have conversations at this point that hey, maybe we can have a fallback option if this service goes down. It must be at the could be at the design time. Because it's impacting the design goals. The other item is avoid single points of failure by not depending on a single global source. There are 2 things that you can do. This is really a very common thing because, for example, a lot of people are dependent on a configuration delivery system. And if that system goes down, basically your system usually goes down. And your upper bound of availability is kind of limited by the upper, boundary of the configuration delivery service. So there are 2 things that you can do. Rather than relying on such a global singleton service, you either can have it replicated, have more of a highly available service, or you can have fallback options such as hard-coded values for configuration. So configuration management also has a lot of things to talk about, and I will give again some examples. There's a lot of conversation usually around what should be, for example, a flag or an environmental variable, or should be delivered by the configuration management system. So the checklist can also create some consensus around that type of stuff. So if you go and take a look at the services around, you may see more consistency. We usually say that static small and stuff that doesn't need to be encrypted can be flags. Everything else should be delivered by the configuration delivers system. And again, you need to have good fallbacks, because if it goes down, you don't want to take down. You want to still be able to restart the process. And the other thing is that the development configuration shouldn't inherit from the production environment. This is common because people think that they should just override a bunch of values in the wrong direction. But what they end up doing is sometimes touching the production from the development environment, which may lead PII, user data leaks, or some other privacy concerns. So it's just good to put it here. So even an inexperienced person comes in, just looks at some of the configuration and tries to copy paste it from Stack Overflow or whatever, at least they will be able to see this. Oh, and they're like, okay, we shouldn't inherit from production because of this and that. It's hard to represent the rationales on the slides, but the checklist usually explains why. So they learn by just reading the checklist. And there are a lot of cases where dynamic configuration is very useful, and you should also document that. Especially when you're onboarding new people, they want to understand what they can reconfigure without restarting the process. So, if you're onboarding something to an SRE, for example, they would like to understand how can I maybe increase more instrumentation data coming from this, because there's a production issue. They don't want to touch the process. They just want to get more data, and it should be documented so they're aware of what is there. Releases can also benefit from some guidelines. The first item is looks very simple, but it's actually not. Document your release process step by step, and even if it's just running one command, there's usually some permissions you need to take. You need to be a part of some group, whatever, in order to be able to push. So document everything there. Document even some of the tools, give some links, some useful tips. Usually troubleshooting can also be documented. There are some frequent troubleshooting cases. If things fail with certain error messages, and if it's not super clear what's going on, try to use the documentation to explain. You can also document how releases affect the SLOs here. When you're pushing new things, it's going to affect the SLO because there's going to be cold starts, there's going to be some temporary latency issues because of because there's nothing in the cache, basically. It's really important for the monitoring person to go through this and understand, so they can be more sure, especially when you're pushing new things, and you still need to wait until things are stabilized. So try to explain as much as possible about your expectations. You should document your canary release process, and if you have an analysis type of flow, this is how we are certain that this canary is going to be successful, documented. So people going through that can learn a lot about the dynamics, also about your service. The fourth one is about your capabilities, but it's useful to set up some mechanisms automatically to revert canaries if possible. And in your organization, not everybody is always aware of the capabilities, so you can use this list as a way to explain also, oh, these are the capabilities we have. If this is an option for you, just go and do it. You should ensure that rollbacks use the same process that rollouts use, because you don't want to add more confusion. You should be able to use the same steps in order to roll back. If there's a production outage, people will be already there will be a lot of tension around, and people will be panicking, and they shouldn't be learning a new process to be able to roll back. So it's really useful to be able to keep them together. A rollback should be more of checking out a previous revision and then pushing it. So it's useful as a reminder to the people that they should be the same. Observability is a very huge topic, but you can maybe mention the essentials specific to the production excellence. The first thing is, you need to make sure that you are collecting some SLIs, the service level indicators, in your, defined in your SLOs. So at least you can tell that we are gathering enough metric from this service, and we can make sure that it's available or not. This is one of the examples of things that you can automate. You can take you can just run it and automate a check, so you can make sure that there's enough metrics coming. You can ensure that client and server side of the instrumentation data can be identified. So if the client is observing something that the server is not observing, you can always tell that it's networking, or it helps you to go and dig. And again, these are some of the practices that you learn over time. And there's no way a person who is just coming in and understanding the value. So the checklist kind of provides you a way to easily understand what has been done in the past and how it contributed. And you can just go through the checklist and learn a lot. We need to tune alerts to reduce toil. This is an ongoing activity. It's not just a review activity. But if you just release some stuff that, just fires a lot of alerts in the beginning, it's definitely not ideal. So you need to make sure that you already reduce some toil before pushing things. Include some of the underlying, platform metrics in your dashboards, especially if you're on a cloud provider. There are tons of things that they are providing. So make sure that your dashboards are designed in a way that you can see, this is my service, and these are my dependencies, and these are the metrics coming from my dependencies. You can also do some homework and set up some alerts based on their SLOs and so on. So when there's an outage, you can easily pinpoint it to the provider or the platform if that's the root case. So the other thing you can do is, for example, very common for us, we use distributed tracing everywhere, but not everybody is aware of what it is and how it works. What is required from the user is usually keep passing a header if it's there, if they don't want to participate into the trace themselves. So just putting it in the checklist, helps them to realize that, there's such a thing, and we need to at least do something just passing the same header, even if we don't want to do anything with distributed tracing. So the security is also a huge topic, and this is not an audit or whatever, but it kind of gives people some guidelines, especially when it comes to designing things and how they should glue things. Examples are very simple stuff the common practices around all the external requests should be encrypted, for example. It really depends on your business and so on. So this is a sample, but you can make sure that projects have proper permissions, IAM configuration. You can just isolate the resources based on networks. You can use VPN to go to the on-prems and so on. You should document and monitor user data access and audit, and you need to make sure that debugging endpoints are limited by, ACLs. For example, if you're exposing some metrics from a service, you need to make sure that only the right people, the development team, can actually access to those endpoints. These are easy to miss. These are actually making people leak, user data all the time. For example, I heard from a couple of customers that they ended up keeping the profile and endpoint public. Because they didn't have a checklist. Nobody was there to remind them that, hey, it's really obvious for some of us, but sometimes you are, importing all these different libraries that's providing you all these black magic options and so on. So it's important that there's a reminder that tells you that you should make sure that it's limited. You can sanitize user input. You can have like payload size restrictions. You can do, block incoming traffic based on user. You can do a lot, and you can, a design, I think, principle. You can avoid external endpoints triggering large number of internal fanouts. Again, this type of knowledge is not accessible to a lot of people, but when you read the checklist, you understand what contributes to some of the failure cases. Capacity planning, I really want to talk about this because this is crucial and it's underestimated. I've rarely seen how people document how their service scales. And this is the #1 thing that you need to understand if there's an outage. You need to explain, for example, is it scaling based on the number of users or size of the incoming payload or number of messages? How does it scale? You're panicking when there's additional traffic and trying to understand what type of patterns are contributing to the outage and so on. So it's important to document how your service scales. You can also document the resource requirements. You can say we need this number of this instance, we need some GPUs, we need a cluster of this, we need this specific hardware. It kind of gives the people that if we want to scale to 5x, this is the sort of hardware we should be going after, and it might be limited. So it's important to go through this, and some other people are going through it and agreeing that it's feasible. The same thing is true about resource constraints. You can say that we need this type of resource with the specific machine type in this particular region. And your cloud provider might not have actual resources in that region. So it's important to have these discussions, even with your cloud provider, as you're going through this list. And you can have some documentation around some code restrictions about creating new resources because, I think in theory, I do believe that I can create a large number of instances, but sometimes you're limited by the rate limiting of the API, the creation API. All of you, if you're working with a cloud provider, they have some rate limits and whatever. So it's important to document those restrictions. And consider trying to have some load tests if possible, even though it's extremely hard to have load tests. And this is, again, a place that you can keep as a reminder. So, okay, I think, if you think that this might be useful, I think the next question is where to start. The first problem is I think you need to acknowledge the need as a team. If one person thinks that it's useful as a reminder, you can keep it, on your notebook as a reminder for yourself. But I think this is more useful when you start to enforce it all around and it becomes kind of a common place to share knowledge. In order to get there, you need to research practices that apply to you. You can't really go and take a look at, you can actually inherit knowledge from some other companies or teams, but it still needs to apply to you. Sometimes you need to go and talk to domain experts. For example, security. They might be able to tell you oh, these are the common patterns that we see again and again. So it might be useful to put, this as a reminder. It's very useful to start having production readiness discussions early because, as I said, this is not a later exercise. It should be at the design time. You need to, think about, talk about some of the trade-offs based on some of the items that I explained. You're going to likely to fail. The good thing is you can learn from the failure and share the knowledge systematically through these checklists. So, you can provide a lot of rationale or also give links to the actual incidents and so on. So if people want to learn more, they can actually take a look and understand. This is also useful to kind of sometimes advice is very outdated, and you don't really want to keep any outdated practices or items on this checklist, then it becomes such a big burden, a process or whatever. In order to keep things useful, it's important to understand why, an item ended up being on the list. And, if you can enforce production readiness practices all across, then you have a common language everywhere, and it's really good. So I said about re-evaluating PRRs is really important because this is a burden. Like people see this as a process, and you don't want to actually end up being there. Anything is going to be seen as a burden if they are not useful. When you are adding new items to the reviews, always provide rationals, remove items when they're obsolete, and go actually deeper. Ask for reviewers, people who are doing this for a long time or whatever, to provide some review on your review system. Starting early on is really crucial because you're designing a new service, and if it's often becoming such a big burden to comply with these practices, it's almost like seen as a compliance type of issue. Like they think, oh, this is yet another compliance that we need to deal with. But if you put these things in the design time, it actually helps the people to, design things with certain trade-offs, and it may give them some insights. They might have this aha things, right? Like they may finally actually see the rationals why things are designed in a particular fashion at your company. So, I mentioned the process thing. I think this is a very common concern. Hey, we don't want to deal with another process. We don't want to have a committee of people, determining what we should do. I just say just don't. If reviews are not useful to you, just don't do it. But reviews can increase the release velocity. It may mean you have faster design decisions. You have more consistency also when it comes to faster design decisions, which means better maintainability. You can be faster when it comes to troubleshooting because you will have certain things, certain debugging endpoints, whatever up there, and is documented. Also, you will have faster onboarding. When people are coming in or you're handing off to different teams, you will be able to have that conversation about your production. So to recap, I think we found this type of readiness checks to help the teams to be more confident. It reduces everyday mistakes and help the onboarding process. You don't often see people in tech saying that I know what I'm doing, but it's just I think the goal is making them more confident, and especially when they're new and just onboarding and have very little experience on that particular type of domain. You can do the review either manually or automatically, and lots of times people do them both because it's complicated or just impossible to do some of the checks that I mentioned automatically. You are not going to automatically go and take a look at the design docs, right? So somebody needs to be there doing manually. It could be self-assisted. You can do your reviews yourself, or you can ask a different team to kind of give you a check. You need to, reduce the bothersome repetitive tasks. If some of these checks are becoming more of a time-consuming thing, nobody's going to do it because it's going to, limit your release velocity. So you need to make sure that it's not adding much in terms of overhead. Otherwise, people are going to abandon these practices. And when introduced as a later thing, it's a policy compliance almost, so you need to make sure that it's represented at the design phase. Some people put it in there, even design documents, just mentioning this is going to be our production readiness practices. If your readiness practices are completely if you can enforce this all across in the company, you don't have to do this at every design doc, but everybody is going to, you need to still maybe make sure that everybody is aligning with it. One example of this is we use some sort of launching calendar system. So before doing launches, we just fill some form, very minimal form. I think somebody's going to kill me because I said it's minimal. But, there's a check there. So it kind of reminds you, hey, you need to review this, take a look at this, and it helps you as soon as you, file that calendar entry. And, I think it's just fair to say, when you do this correctly, it should help your production maturity, which may mean that your velocity of releasing things should increase. The cost of having no readiness reviews and production anxiety is also not ideal. Repeated mistakes and overthinking is not a good situation. Also, repeated mistakes and trial error culture is like creating the more blameful cultures, and people just getting more and more scared about touching the production, thinking that they will get the blame. So reviews can increase, and improve the, organization to adopt a more blameless culture and make things more efficient and effective. I can't really stress this enough, but most importantly, this is not just like checking some boxes. It's more of like a set of reminders. And this is a way to canonically have a place to say, oh, these are some of the practices we learned over time. And provide justifications for that reason, explain the historical reasons. This also allows the people to come in and think about it and like, oh, this doesn't apply to us anymore, and they can remove those items. Don't make it a burden, like keep the process lightweight and useful. That's the key, right? Production readiness, I think, is a good, powerful tool when implemented well. But it could be easily seen as a process, and people are going to abandon it as soon as it's seen as a process that adds overhead. So that's all I have for tonight. I'm so shocked that everybody was able to keep it up. Thanks so much for coming here, and I'm wishing you all a happy production and less production anxiety. Thanks.
So, thank you so much, Jaana. Thanks for the great talk and the great insights. I'm sure there's some opportunity.